Oh, hi! Mark Pearson, Executive and Artistic Director of the College Light Opera Company. Welcome to Off the Clock, a weekly show where I get to catch up with CLOC alums. Off the Clock is made possible by a generous gift from Hope Lincoln Baker. This week, I got to catch up with one of my dearest friends and a staple of the Highfield podium, Maestro Jonathan Brennan. Let's hear what he had to say. All right. Well, Jonathan Brennan, I am so thrilled and happy to see you, albeit virtually. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Off the Clock.
Oh, thank you for asking me, Mark. It's always wonderful being back at CLOC, sort of this way, but it's the closest we're going to get.
Exactly, yeah, till next year. Can you just remind everyone who you are, when you were at CLOC, and what you do now?
So I first came to CLOC in 2005 as a violinist, purely by chance. I knew nothing about CLOC. And then I became an associate conductor and then a principal conductor. So I have spent pretty much the good part of my career as a musician at CLOC in some capacity. And now I work as a conductor, as an orchestral conductor in New England, where I conduct a symphony orchestra down in the Hartford area called the Farmington Symphony. And I direct the Worcester Youth Orchestras based in Massachusetts. And then I freelance a lot all over the New England, guest conducting and doing clinics and adjudications. And yeah, wherever there's work, I'll go.
Great. Do you have a count? Do you know how many shows you've music directed at CLOC?
I think it's around 30 or so. I know the wonderful Liz Hastings holds the worldwide Guinness Book of Records. And then I think it's Mary, and then I think it's maybe David Wyman and myself. I know around the gala that somebody went through and counted. It's amazing that when I became a music director in 2010 that I was able to conduct so many shows in a short time period and a huge variety of styles as well.
Yeah, I mean, you've worked on pretty much everything from operetta to contemporary musical here. So were you always kind of headed toward being a conductor? You said you started out as a violinist, right?
Yes, I actually had no aspirations to be a professional musician, um, and I went to undergrad to Drew on a poetry scholarship, which I always like to joke was equally as profitable as a career. But in high school, I had won a couple of poetry competitions, and the various department heads and my guidance counselor just said, "Oh, well, this is what you're supposed to do." And of course, you're 18 and you have no idea, so you just do what adults tell you to do. And then I sung in a male a cappella group called 36 Madison Avenue, and one of the basses was the redoubtable Buste Bickley, and he was at CLOC that summer in 2005 as a stage tech. And typical CLOC, a violinist dropped out or didn't show up on the first day, and B Haslam called me and said, if you can be here by 12 o'clock, you've got the job. And I had nothing to do that summer, so I got dropped off. And that summer at CLOC completely changed my whole career outlook. And working with some really fine conductors and some incredible players in the orchestra, and just sort of seeing the collaboration that happened between all these various departments, it completely inspired me. And I went back to college that next year and changed my major and ended up double majoring in music and history.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
right. So I guess I didn't realize that. I knew you were friends with Buste, but he actually is the one who brought you to CLOC.
He was, yeah. I think he must have called me, probably from that payphone underneath the stairs. Yeah, I think he must have called my mom or the house. I don't know, but he was the connection. Yeah, and I had never heard of CLOC before.
And had you played in pits before that, or had you played primarily in orchestras, or had you had experience with theater?
No, I mean, I had obviously been to many theatrical productions, but never played any kind of pit orchestra music at all, been orchestral. Yeah, I was probably the least exposed to any kind of other style of music as a musician. And that's what's great about CLOC is that you go there and you just gain such a different perspective and a different introduction.
And would you say well, I guess you did say it changed your trajectory into music, but you were still playing, right, while you were at school, but
Yeah,
you thought of it more as a hobby, or?
yeah, as sort of a hobby, a place where I like to socialize with my friends, and I played in youth orchestras outside of school. I played in school and played in college in the university orchestra and sang in the chorale. And I mean, music had been a huge part of my upbringing as a child. Starting at 5 and 6, was when I started violin and also sung in a boys' choir in England in that grand boys' choir tradition. So, I mean, it was a very traditional musical upbringing, but I think gave me a really good, solid foundation of music. Um, so, yeah, music was something I definitely wanted to do. My grandmother was very musical, and she loved Gilbert and Sullivan as well. So I definitely knew that's sort of like a national. Well, it was sort of a national pastime in England. Not
Gilbert and Sullivan.
Gilbert and Sullivan, yeah, not my grandma. Although she was a legend. Uh, yeah, it definitely was something that was very well known in our household was GNS. And I remember my my grandmother used to belong to sort of the townswomen's uh, operatic society, and they would do. I mean, they used to do things like the White Horse Inn and the Arcadians and all these archaic Edwardian musicals that really only these sort of local operatic companies in England can get away with doing. And, everybody is involved. Women dressed up as, to play the men parts. And so my grandmother was basically a baritone. So, so she always played the male roles in these operatic society productions. Yeah.
Well, enough about grandma. Let's get back to you. So so after your summer at CLOC, the next summer you came back as an associate, or did you have another summer as a violinist?
I had another summer as a violinist, and then I came back as an associate.
So what prompted that change, or did you, when you made the change to thinking about music as a career, was it automatically, oh, and I want to be a conductor, or did that take some time to realize?
My university professor who conducted the orchestra and chorale sort of took me on as a I don't know a mentor, and thought that seemed like that I had, I don't know, a, the skills that would lend itself. And I had taken a couple of conducting classes and really enjoyed it. And Also worked as an assistant conductor and an apprentice to a pretty big active choral society near the university. And that conductor, Anne Matlack, took me under her wing. And so I sort of began to be surrounded by all these music directors and conductors who were having a pretty big effect on me. And I was very lucky, giving me a lot of opportunity to get in front of a group, which as a young conductor is extremely difficult. I think I think maybe even more so when you're in school, because the academic calendar is so rigorous, and it's such a timeline and a deadline. There's really not much time in a typical university ensemble schedule to hand over the podium, to a student to kind of figure out what they're doing. But I was very lucky in that I had some really good people around me who were encouraging me and pushing me. Yeah, so I applied to CLOC as an associate. I think actually B Haslam at the time asked me if I would rather be the work director rather than an associate conductor. And I said no.
Well, you never know where your career is going to go.
That's true. That's true. Many a clock conductor have had their turn at the work director role.
So what would you say are the most important skill set or qualifications to be a conductor?
Um, I would say patience is the biggest characteristic, which I think is something I always make sure I bring onto the podium. You know, and I remember being told very early on, it's like when you step through that door into the rehearsal room, you have to leave everything behind. You can't bring any personal baggage. If you've had a bad day, you're feeling rather cross, you just have to put that aside, because for that hour and a half, 2 hours that you're there working with them, your job is to get the most out of those musicians in front of you. And as cheesy as it sounds, I think having passion, and as a Brit, you know, that's a struggle for us sometimes to be passionate about things. You know, about horses and dogs. Oh, definitely. About music. Well, I don't know, but I like to think, you know, I bring my own sense of reserved passion to the podium. You know, um, so and I think for me, the quality I think is important is collaboration, is that willingness to work with other people. You know, an orchestra or chorus is made of many people. It is not just made of you. You're really just kind of the medium to translate between those in front of you and those hopefully one day who are back sitting behind you. That's your job. You know, job is to be a collaborator, to be patient, to be passionate, and to be an advocate, and to use your work as a conductor to help advocate change and to advocate for the workers, for the orchestral or choral musicians, or the soloists. And I know that the higher I've gone in my career, the more I've realized my responsibility to make sure there's, you know, fair pay and fair compensation, and you know that we're programming music that's representing various styles and traditions.
Great. I mean, that's all really important stuff. Wonderful. So Jonathan, while I was, we're going through a lot of vaults and cleaning out, and I did find I won't call it a relic, but something from the past. I'm not sure if this was your first year or second year. Do you remember when this was?
Well, I think I still have that shirt. That I think was my first year as an associate conductor, so that would have been 2008.
Great. Oh, well, you haven't changed too much. Do you? And it prompts me to ask my question. Do you have a favorite project or that you worked on so far at CLOC?
I have to say, actually, probably the first one that we did together, which was my first show there, Naughty Marietta, was pretty special, I think.
Yes.
I mean, looking back on it, it was definitely too much of an undertaking at that time. And especially being a really, really young and green conductor to take that on. But you know, when you're banging on the doors to get out of the gate to do something, you know, an obstacle seems like, oh, that can easily be overcome. But I learned a great deal, and especially the academic process of going back to all of Herbert's original scores and reconstructing.
You went to DC, didn't you, for that project?
I did. Yeah, I went to the Library of Congress, to the music division, for a few days, and they pretty much have all of the Herbert materials now. The family gave it to Library of Congress, and yeah, I went through rehearsal notes, and he pretty much his entire manuscript is still there with all of his etchings and scratchings, and photocopied it all, because this was really before you could take a picture of your iPhone with cam scanner. And I know when we had found a couple like stage directions in the score which you had used. It was just a really enlightening process. And then to check it against an original set of orchestra parts, which is really, really rare for an early musical. I mean, you can't even find those for, you know, the original R&H orchestrations. You know, they're lost. But to find those and can compare them to the score, and you can kind of see why cuts were made and why things were reorchestrated. When we eventually put it up, we tried to bring it back to that opening night, which I think every kind of musicologist wants to kind of recreate. And I think there was only one number that we couldn't find, which she was supposed to sing to the casket maids, and I couldn't even find a piano vocal score, but we knew it existed somewhere because it was in the opening night. What's it called? Libretto. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, can you mention a little bit why orchestra parts for those shows are so difficult to find?
Well, they were often made, and this goes not only for operettas, but for sort of the classical orchestra world. They were copied from the manuscript, and oftentimes the composer, Sullivan included, he would do an outline, and then he'd have a coding system to say, take this measure, put it over here. So it's this copy and paste, and so oftentimes the parts themselves were maybe only being copied out 2 or 3 days before the first reading, and which would be followed a few days next by the premiere. So the parts were really shoddily put together. They were usually full of cuts, and they were taped, and things were glued over, and and then they were sometimes they were taken out on the road, or that they'd have a road set of parts. And these things were used and abused. I mean, they were not taken care of. And then they just go and sit in some warehouse in a box and forgotten about, and then often got destroyed, succumbed to mildew and mold. I remember actually when we were looking for parts for the White Horse Inn, I think it was the place in England that had a set, and they'd had a warehouse flood when the Thames had come up. And I think we were on the phone with them both, and it's like, well, it's a W, so that means, it could have been on the bottom of the shelf when we had the flood. So we may not have them.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's a truth for a lot of those shows that aren't done very often. And even some of them that are done often, you don't realize that you go to the licensing house. And I think what is, correct me if I'm wrong, you'd know better than I would, but what is offered for Marietta is a very different sounding revival from is it the 40s?
The 40s. Yeah, it was, it's a pared down orchestration for a 40s revival. And a lot of the parts came from an old touring production from the 20s. So the original orchestra was like 100 pieces in the pit, and they pared it down Tams Whitmark for like a 20-piece orchestra, which is the typical CLOC size. But in that process, all the orchestral color and timbre was lost, and I think we wanted to kind of recreate that. And I think CLOC had an old set of Marietta parts from that 40s revival, and they were helpful because there were things in there which filled in some of the gaps in the original manuscripts. Yeah, but Tams Whitmark, I mean, there was this, most of their music is not stored, in their main office. It's stored in a warehouse in, like, I don't know, it's somewhere in New Jersey, like Secaucus or something. And that burnt down about 20 years ago, and they lost a huge amount, of their catalog, just like devastating. The same thing happened at the old Chappelle warehouse in the UK. Like decades worth of classic shows and parts and scripts were just lost overnight.
Yeah, and that's all before things were digitalized. So a lot of that stuff is gone.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned you might have a recording actually from our Marietta. Is that correct?
I do. So I have spent part of my quarantine here going through some of my archives, and I have one here of Marietta. Give me a few minutes. I know I pulled it up, and of course now I can't find it.
It's great. Do you remember which performance it was? Was it?
I believe this. Yes, because in those early days I used to record every performance. No, this one is definitely closing night, and I think what I have to do now is share my computer sound with you. And yeah, this is the Act One finale, which
What year was this?
this is 2010. And so this is the Act One finale, um, typical, operetta characters. Characters' true identities are revealed, accusations are made, the action stops briefly for some sort of Mozart-esque moment of he said, she said, multiple, like there's this whole funny thing about multiple conflicting pronouns and I mean, very, very stylistic at that time. And then it kind of just erupts into a full-blown, Italian opera finale, people just screaming at the top of their lungs. And I remember, I think it has like a chorus of Italians and a chorus of multiple choruses singing against each other. It was very, very exciting. And when I listened to it, I was like, wow, this is very operatic, So let's hope this works. I'm going to mute myself and take a listen to the Act One finale of Naughty Marietta.
I thought the boy's too sweet for that. Marry our contestant Altena!
What fun!
What a great act finale. I mean,
That is a great act finale, and I so much bravado.
One prize, one's best.
And that's that the bell moment. That's the convent girl moment where it's completely random from a plot perspective, but the convent girls cross, and Marietta somehow hides herself in there, and there's some kind of magic moment, and then everyone comes back and gone.
Yeah, they all kneel for the convent girls, and I think she joins in with them. It was,
I don't know, the beginning of the opera, she's hiding in the fountain and shit. It's
I always wondered, like, how did she not drown by hiding in the fountain?
You can't think too much about it.
But such is the magic of operetta that
yes.
you don't have to think.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, I haven't listened to that in forever. It is a wonderful score, great show.
And I can still see, like, Gabe Johnson, was that his name? Who was the governor, and Christine as Marietta, and Ethan, wonderful Ethan, who was Etienne.
Etienne, the son,
Just we were really lucky. We had a great cast, and Patrick, who was Captain Dick.
Captain Dick. Wait, who's saying Rodolfo?
Oh, Scott Wasserman.
Scott Wasserman. He was hysterical.
So funny, and it still has one of the best lines in an operetta from that time period, where basically the townspeople are arguing about, is Marietta actually a simple Italian peasant, or is she the countess? And Rodolfo says, no, like, this lady is my son.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Is she the Countess del Tena, or is she Rodolfo's son?
They tried to hide her as his son to protect her. Yeah.
Great. Gosh, it's a fun show. So are you still in contact with a lot of folks that you're at CLOC almost every year, but do you still keep in contact with some of the folks from your early days?
Not as much as I would like. I did recently reconnect with Laura McLaughlin, who was a clarinet player my first year, and we hadn't spoken, I think, since 2005, and I hired her to do some coaching for my youth orchestra during the lockdown, and that's kind of been the beauty, is I've been able to use musicians from all over the country, and we chatted for a minute, and it was so lovely. I mean, she has now a pretty dynamic career as a professional clarinet player out in the Midwest, teaches at a university and plays for a few orchestras, and it was so good to see her.
That's
I
great.
Probably keep in touch a bit more with people when I was an associate, like Kate McAllister.
Yes.
Try and see her whenever I'm down in New York. But sort of two of my really good CLOC friends. I mean, you and I have obviously met that first year, and being terrified of going into the costume shop to see you. But I remember meeting Jacob Allen that first summer.
Yes.
And then many years later, I think, I don't know how, I may have reconnected with him when I was looking for Marietta materials, but we sort of struck up a correspondence, as one might say, and then eventually we were able to do a show together and have become really good friends. And then the wonderful James Mills, who I met not at CLOC, but at the gala that we did together for the theater, and Avery Funkhauser introduced James and I, and became fast friends. But CLOC is a place where you cannot see somebody for a decade, and then you can instantly pick up a conversation.
That's true. Very true. Yeah. So Jonathan, you're in an interesting, well, I think, an interesting situation career-wise, where you work with a professional orchestra and you work with a youth orchestra. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that is, and the, when you're going into one room versus going into the other room, and how you approach them differently?
With my youth orchestra, I think that the approach I've always taken is that I think back to um, how meaningful it was to play in a youth orchestra when I was a young musician, and what a safe space it was, and how it was a place where I was amongst people that were had the same interests as me, and you didn't feel like you were the music geek, you know. Um, and and so I really try and work with all of my colleagues to make our program very welcoming and accepting, and there's a place where students can come and be themselves, and you know, really push themselves as musicians, and that's what we try to do. But at the same time, make it sort of feel like it's a place where they can maybe let their guard down a bit and not have to worry about all of the pressures that kids deal with now, both at school and on social media. But you know, working with students, nothing will ever cease to surprise me. There's always something new that comes up, and it really requires you to be incredibly diplomatic at times, understanding, and have a very good sense of humor, but also to be inspired when you least expect it. And I've had some pretty memorable moments with my students. We were on tour in the Czech Republic last year. We were doing the Dvorak's Eighth Symphony in the concert hall that it was written for, and the that was just an incredibly eye-opening moment for them, and to see how they're playing this piece and they actually they can hear this is why it was written. This is why these pauses are here, because it was written for this space. And so suddenly, the reason all the notes have to be 16th with staccatos versus, you know, eighth notes is because the whole just, you know, echoes and echoes, and it had to be short. So it's moments like that, you know, that you look for, that moment of realization, and then just to see how over the course of 3 or 4 years, how a student completely comes out of their shell, and some have decided to go on to be musicians, and others have said, you know, I want to keep on playing in college and maybe play in a community orchestra, or play at my church and support my local symphony, but I don't want to make this a career. But I think music serves as a really good tool for providing a space for young kids to kind of find themselves and build their own community. Um,
That's great. What is it that you love most about what you do?
um, I think it's being able to collaborate on almost a daily basis, to work with other people. Even though my job is as a music director, which is to direct, but it still feels like I am working with a large group of people that have placed all this trust in me, to create something with them. Um, and and then when we're at a place like CLOC, just adding that whole other side, it's I know it definitely feeds me, and it definitely gives me a different outlook as well. It can feel so, sometimes a bit not a bit lonely on the orchestral podium, because it's comes down to you eventually to make that judgment call, and you're taking what's coming out in front of you, and shaping um, and interpreting as you go along, and but to have another colleague to take that to and say, oh, why is this written this way? How are you thinking of staging this? I mean, it's good when we have a concerto soloist, because oftentimes I take my cues just from them. You know, I have a general sense of what I want from the concerto, but really I look to them to see how they're going to do it, so we can complement their artistry. Um, right before the shutdown happened, the lockdown. I don't know what we're calling it these days, but with Farmington Symphony, we were doing an all-American program, and it was the Barber Violin Concerto, Knoxville, summer of 1915, and Lincoln Portrait, and then the Hartford premiere of Florence Price's Symphony. And those who don't listening at home who don't know who Florence Price is, she was the first African American woman to have her symphony premiered by one of the big major orchestras, which was the Chicago Symphony in the 1930s. And I came across it last summer at a conference, well, 2 summers ago at a conference. Like, I have to program this work. It's incredible. You know, I mean, I had to go through the whole licensing process and knowing that we were giving the regional premiere of it, you know, it had only been performed once in Connecticut down at Yale. So it was time and it was needed. And the board and I thought, let's couple it with the All American program. But let's make a long story even longer here. The soloist that we had for the Barber, Liz Miller, you know, I had been rehearsing with the orchestra, but it doesn't really work as an orchestral piece, even though it's written for orchestra and soprano. Sometimes you can rehearse a piece and it kind of just works. You know, there are gaps missing, but it wasn't until that Liz came and sang with us at the dress rehearsal that the piece just like clicked, and suddenly all the little mutes and orchestrating techniques made much more sense. And you can listen to it on a recording and you can sit and you can study it, but until you have everybody in the room collaborating together, the piece takes on a life of its own. I was, and she, it's so difficult to sing. I mean, it is full of mixed meter, harmonically very adventurous for that time period. And usually what I like to do is with a soloist, like, let's just go through it once. And if we get lost, let's just keep on going. Let's just, you know, forge our way through it. And she did it flawlessly. I was so impressed. And that's another moment as a conductor you live for that, because you're conducting and like there's so much tension. It's like, oh, this is right. This could fall apart and fail at any time. And the sigh of relief that she gave out afterwards was like this. I was like, all right, let's take 5 minutes, and then we'll go and we'll troubleshoot some spots. Yeah.
Great. If you could change something about your industry or your career, what would it be?
I don't think we as an industry should be so afraid to try something different. And people I would say orchestras and arts organizations, orchestras, we're talking about the orchestral here, shouldn't be afraid to program a piece or do a project that's a little bit different, a little bit out of the usual path. Audiences should not be afraid to go and take a listen, and sponsors should not be afraid to support it. It's a three-way deal here. You know, we've all got to kind of just take a leap of faith and know that it may not be the same huge result as doing a war horse, but at the same time, you know, you have to try and you have to take a chance, and you'll learn so much in the process. You know, you'll learn what you as an organization are capable of doing. And you know, I think that sponsors and foundations will, you know, not put so much value on numbers. They're very into like quantifiers, like how many people attended, like how many posters were put up. It's like, well, yes, that is important because you want to demonstrate, but at the same time, if as we are pushing these boundaries and bringing more people to the table, which is the appropriate thing and the right thing to be doing, you have to look at the bigger picture, that these are important decisions to be made that shouldn't be dependent on quantifiers. You know, the artistic and cultural and ethical and moral weight of it is the biggest justifier. That is your quantifier. It's like this is an important step, you know.
Right.
So, but I think there's a lot of fear and a lot of hand wringing about, oh, we're going to lose all this money. It's like, well, perhaps, but perhaps not.
Yeah, I think your risk is a huge part of trying
Yeah.
to make art, and it's important to remember that.
Yeah.
So, what have you been doing in quarantine? Have you been rehearsing? Have you had any, especially with the youth orchestra? How's that been working?
So since we were fortunate in some regards that we had two major concerts the week before everything got shut down here in Massachusetts. Um, and I gave sort of this CLOC-inspired speech to our Symphony Youth Orchestra, which is our flagship. And I said, guys, like because it was a bad dress rehearsal, and I said, you never know when it's going to be your last performance. You're only as good as the last notes that you play. And if you choose to not bring your A game, to this afternoon's performance, like, why are we doing this together? And I look back and think that was just, exactly so, because we never had a live performance after that. So for my youth orchestra, we pivoted pretty quickly to online sectionals and master classes and guest speakers. You came and spoke, and then we did
God, that feels like years ago. But you're right.
like years ago. Yeah. I think I definitely had much more hair than that was before I could get a haircut.
I didn't have any more hair.
And then we did a big recording project with all the program together, sending in separate tracks and videos and piecing it together. And the summer we usually take as a recess. And we have about 4 or 5 different plans now for September, and we're just sort of waiting now to see what happens with the governor and with the schools. We usually take our cues from the school system, but it's kind of a wait and see at the moment. We'll be back in some form, I think, most likely a hybrid model. For Farmington, we did a Symphony on the Sofa series where musicians played from their homes, and basically I hosted, and then we live streamed it out. We had a couple of really frustrating technical glitches in the very beginning, and eventually went to a pre-recorded model, and then released it. But some of our players live, both the spouses play in the symphony, so we did get to have a couple of duets, which was nice. And in July, our concertmaster did a recital in our rehearsal venue, which is a really nice space. And I went down and I ran the video for it, and that was live. And that was the first concert I had been to since March 8th, so July 4th, and it was a really sort of eerie experience. I mean, just me there sitting by myself, watching them play this recital. He and our principal keyboardist. So it's next year we're probably just going to be doing mostly string repertoire. We're probably going to do a recording cycle of the Mendelssohn string symphonies, and then release those as live streams, as premieres. I think we're not quite sure what to do with winds and brass yet for adults, and the members don't really want to play and rehearse outside. But it's a wait and see. We're all kind of just waiting. I feel fortunate that both organizations that I work for have really proactive and steady board leadership, and we've been fiscally responsible for a number of years now. So quite a few things can change, but I'm glad that we have the resources to see this through. It's certainly going to be an interesting time for the whole nonprofit industry. Our main concert hall here in Worcester is closed through October. The staff have been furloughed. Our big Broadway house, the Hanover's, closed. So I think the most important thing, one thing that CLOC has done, is to keep on engaging with your audience and adapt and reimagine as you can. To keep reminded that the CLOC mission is still so important. It still can exist outside of the high field.
Yeah, it's certainly trying to make the best of a really difficult situation on all fronts.
Yeah.
Well, Jonathan, it's been absolutely delightful to catch up with you. I'm going to end with a final question that I've been asking everyone, and that is, if you had one piece of advice for your 20-year-old self, what would it be?
I would say, um, can I give two answers?
Yes, you may.
Okay. Um, make sure that you always call your mum every day. And the next thing is that don't worry too much about the future. Things always have a way of working out, that everything happens for a reason, especially professionally. And you'll know when an opportunity is the right one. And sometimes you have to lose a couple to then find the one that works for you. Um, but things, you've got to have faith in the way that things work, and however you, those at home, believe that the universe works. But I have faith that someone out there has a plan, and it will all work out. Just maybe not how you expected it to.
Great. Two excellent pieces of advice, especially the call your mom one.
Yeah. Did you call Gail today?
No, actually, I have a missed call from Gail. I have to call her. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to always to talk to you, and you know, and I miss CLOC very much, and all of our wonderful colleagues and friends that we have there, and all the patrons, you know, lifelong friendships, and you know, waving to people on the patio. You don't realize the things that you miss until you don't have it.
Very true.
Very
Well,
special. Very
hopefully,
special place.
hopefully next year.
Yes. Mark.
Thank you.
Off the Clock is part of our larger series, Digital Clock. Digital Clock is made possible by a generous gift from Phil and Liz Gross. If you'd like to learn more about our programming or how you can become a supporter, visit us at collegelightoperacompany.com. Tune in again next week for another episode of Off the Clock.